Hi everyone, welcome to another issue of British Journal of Social Work. This time I have a great pleasure to be discussing the special issue on disasters and COVID, which is coming out as a special issue 51.5 of the British Journal of Social Work, and a great pleasure to be joined by Professor Margaret Alston, who is Professor of Social Work at the University of Newcastle and Emerita Professor at Monash University, both in Australia, and Professor Amy Chow, who's Professor of Social Work at the University of Hong Kong. It has been such a joy and pleasure working with you both over this issue came together so fast. We've been working only for about half a year, but there's been a lot of activity, and it feels a really apt issue to summarize social work knowledge that has developed quite rapidly during 2020. When we were preparing for this discussion, Amy said that I should pass over to Margaret as the kind of main ideas person and initiator for this special issue. Margaret, do you want to say a bit about why you felt this issue was important and how it evolved?
Well, thank you very much for that lovely introduction. That was very nice. We conceptualized, as you well know, we conceptualized this edition about 2 years ago, and the catalyst for me was the high number of disasters that have been occurring in Australia, including bushfires and floods and drought. And it just seems like there was one thing after another. And so I did approach the British Journal editorial board and asked them, you know, I thought it was a wise thing to do because so many people were experiencing this. Social work was only in its infancy around disaster practice. And I think the more we can expose that and build on that, the better. The extraordinary thing happened, you know, after we'd conceptualized it, was, of course, the COVID outbreak. And that took everyone by surprise, including us. And we had to quickly scramble because one of the things that emerged from that was that a lot of the papers that then started coming in for the special edition were dealing with COVID. But I'll hand over to Amy to add to that because we have a lot to say about all of that.
Well, thank you, Margaret, for inviting me to join her good work. When she sent her invitation, I think this is very important because all along when disaster happen, when there is a pandemic, everyone think of the first line respondent or maybe the medical staff. Social workers seems to be not visible in a way. So I do think that we have a lot of work we have been doing, but not make it very clear. So this is a very good opportunity for us to share with others what we have done and what can be done in this very special time. So thank you, Margaret, and thank you, Rima, for the invitation.
The surprising thing for me was not only that I'd approached the journal about disasters, but how surprisingly similar the issues around COVID were. So here we had a disaster in our imagining that was taking over not only, you know, certain pockets of countries, but in fact the whole world. So the global dimensions of COVID took everyone by surprise, but it also created enormous threat, and it was indeed a health crisis and indeed a disaster along the lines of what we'd envisaged for the journal. So the COVID outbreak, the papers that were coming in, we were seeing the similarities in the issues being raised by people, you know, what happens in disaster and what happens as response to COVID across the world were quite similar. One thing, though, that was also similar was that social workers were not visible as frontline workers. And I think that's an issue that we need to take on head on as a profession, that invisibility of social workers, even though they're actually at the front line of disaster practice. Is that right, Amy?
So true, yeah. We have half of our paper on, more than half on COVID, but we also have a few which is on other disaster. We actually find a lot of similarities. But one thing that touched me so strongly, it reminds us about the value of social work. And I do think trauma touch on different people different way. But for those who are in vulnerable group or marginalized population, most of the time the resources may not reach out to that group, and the inequalities will come up very clearly. So as a social workers, how we can maintain a social justice to ensure everyone is having equal attention. I think a few of our authors from the papers, they highlight this point, which I think it is a very good reminder of what we need to do in our profession.
So these papers, I mean, this is really fascinating, and it is a field that I'm also working in. So this area of social work in extremes, as Margaret mentioned, it's a new and evolving field where social workers are fairly invisible to this day. So focusing on people that we work with through the topics that were dealt with, and what kind of range of topics did you get, first of all, about disasters, and what were the studies dealing with COVID? Were there any specific groups, or were there studies that were trying to address and offer social work skills to more general population?
Well, interestingly enough, the papers that covered COVID were quite similar in their approach or what the determinations around social work practice, but they were very much country-based. So some of them used quantitative surveys, and some were focused on interviews. But the issue was very much based on country, but the similarities between what they were producing across several different countries was quite stark. One of the things that really struck me about both sets of papers, the disaster papers and the COVID papers, was how workers were alluding to a new normal. Now, we knew in our disaster work that a lot of people that we work with in disasters talk about having to come through the disaster and adjust to a new normal. It was in some ways a little surprising to see that language also emerging in the COVID papers, that in fact we're facing a new normal where pandemics are now part of our history and potentially part of our future. So I think that was something that clicked with me, to see that we not only face this, but we also as practitioners need to prepare for that and to address this issue of how people approach the future.
So it really is something that is all-encompassing and affects the wider context of our practice, and that societal and society-wide and global, as you say, dimensions of it are so pervasive that it's not about building back to something, but accepting the change which has happened and which is going to affect the work going forward in many different ways.
Indeed, indeed. And just coming back to the issue of the invisibility of social workers, a couple of our authors wrote about the issue of disaster governance and the need for social workers to be involved in the governance around disasters. And here I'm including that as a generic term covering COVID as well. The need for that disaster governance and for us to be there in that process where immediate plans are being made and where social workers are brought in from the get-go. So I think that was something that struck me, that that need for us to, as a profession, to really approach this in the future in a way that makes social work one of the frontline obvious workers, not only in the work that we do and the acknowledgement of that, but also the media representations of what happens in disasters.
So really involving social work in mainstream responses rather than focusing. And one of the things that kind of emerge in literature today is in very scanty, and I really am fascinated and look forward to reading this issue because it feels that some key themes are going to be drawn forward kind of as a new standing ground for us to explore social work in relation to extreme events such as pandemics or natural disasters, around being built into the mainstream responses to disasters. Do the authors, and is your sense based on your own work and the work you have read for the special issue, do we need to kind of offer specialist work and focusing mainly, as Amy mentioned earlier, the inequalities that come through and are highlighted through the work that the authors did seem pervasive? Do we need to focus still on the groups that we usually work with? So people, for example, for children without parental care, or children separated from their families, disabled people, older people, people with mental health issues? Or are there some of the papers dealing with more general social skill set being offered to general populations?
I'll let Amy answer that, yes.
Yeah, we actually have a few papers on families and children, and they offer ideas on how we can support families in this very special time. And surprisingly, one paper actually highlight that even though they are facing disasters and trauma, but the children and adolescents are found to be resilient, and they have a lot of good coping skills. And the author even suggests that we should tap in the resilience concept from the child and bring a change in the family. I think that is something very optimistic and give us some direction, not so negative, but we can also see trauma and disaster can be an opportunity for intervention.
Another issue that came through in that light is the series of papers on the education of social workers and the need for us not only to adjust our practice, but the way that education to social work students was in upheaval right through the COVID lockdown period. So the issue of education of social workers has two prongs. How do we train social workers in the conditions that were present during COVID lockdown? And then the second thing is, how do we prepare social workers for future disaster practice? And I think we're a bit lean on that side of things, and that we need as a profession to actually build in disaster social work into mainstream social work education.
And there is the kind of two strands of kind of people advocating for that, the work in social work in extreme events to be embedded into all curricula for social work education, and those who feel that that is a specialist field and that maybe we need a specialist kind of workforce who is specifically trained to deal with disasters. But it sounds like the papers that we are, and all the learning we have in this global phenomenon, suggests that this is something that we really need to understand better, regardless of where our work will take us, because it can happen anywhere.
Well, that's my view, and I'm sure there are alternate views, but my view is that, the future is so fraught with the possibility of climate change induced disasters, natural disasters, and now the possibility of future pandemics, that we really need to prepare social work students for a future that will embrace that at some point in time. But it also does another thing. It alerts students to the need to self-protect and self-care, because in opening this can of worms, there is a view that social workers will rush to the barricades, and we need to make sure that they do that with a sense of their own self-efficacy and the need to look after themselves. So we need to train social workers in all manner of issues around that, as well as everything else.
So organizing.
And that came through in the COVID papers, where writers were talking about things that were happening to their social work profession in their country, and that was that real desire to help people at the same time as they felt their own health might be compromised, and more particularly their family's health if they brought back something. So that need for self-care is really evident in the papers.
So it seems relevant not just because of the nature of the work, but also because those events are really quite different to many other ones, because it really emphasizes that this can happen to anyone. Natural disasters happen to social workers just as much as people we usually work with, as did COVID, as you say. So that element of self-care is very, very important, and organizing support for social workers themselves.
Yeah.
And in terms of, I mean, I want to return also to the topic you mentioned, Amy, around inequalities. What are some of the themes that are coming out? Because another thing that has kind of some fragments of evidence so far is how domestic violence also increases, and that particular marginalized groups in society, whether through race, ethnicity, or by the nature of using social welfare support, even, that those people are even more, those groups of within the society are even more vulnerable and require even further support to address inequalities and social injustice, as you mentioned.
Yeah. And one paper actually is talking about animals, which we might overlooked. Yeah, trauma and disaster not only affect human beings, but how we as a social workers can also protect the rights of animals. I do think that is an other interesting point.
Oh, what would that work entail?
Hmm?
What would that work entail? What does the article suggest?
Oh, actually, they suggest that not only because this paper is from Australia, so they are not only talking about pet animals, they also talk about the farm animals and also the animals in the wild environment. So how we can make sure the survivals, how to maintain the relationship, and it is something we should take care of.
And great care for the environment and green social work, and looking into issues of sustainability and environment protection. Margaret.
A couple of the papers dealt with vulnerable groups within countries. So the Arab minority in Israel was one group discussed. The new migrants to Australia and the way they were treated during the COVID lockdown was the subject of another paper. And there was even a paper on social workers who felt they were disadvantaged within the profession. So it's an interesting insight into how we address the vulnerabilities of people, and the need for us to be quite conscious of that diversity and vulnerability, you know, and how different things don't affect people in the same way.
And is your sense that on one hand, kind of, because within our profession we have imaginary continuum of kind of more psychological and kind of within person focused work, and those which focus more on broader social issues and context and in wider justice and human rights, and the psychosocial approach which tries to merge those two and kind of unify them in a more unified view. Is your sense that certain perspectives prevail as the ways of exploring and the lens to explore these issues, or are we merging more towards more truly psychosocial work, acknowledging wider social context as well as those individual psychological factors and impacts?
Before I pass to Amy, I would say one thing you have left out of that analysis, which is all true, is the link between social and ecological.
True.
So, you know, that is going to be a new factor in social work education going forward. We can't not acknowledge the environment as a really critical part now of people's well-being. So that link between social issues and ecological issues is something that we have to make quite transparent. But I'll pass to Amy.
Yeah. And actually, I would like to recommend one paper, which is the last paper by Booty. She used the concept of hope, and then she introduced an intervention approach by, at a clinical level, it is about cognitive changing, on how you can inspire hope to the person. But at the same time, they also mentioned, she also mentioned about the importance of structural change in order to elicit hope for future. So I think this is good, because a lot of time when we talk about disasters, trauma, pandemic, we only think about the negative consequence and how we can do the remedial work. But what strikes people most is the future. So if we can work together with the client, with the community on what is the future, and give them some direction of hope, and that will be something social workers need to do. So she include the micro levels, but also the macro levels, which I think this is a good direction for us to reflect.
Excellent.
Indeed.
And you mentioned briefly, Margaret, the methodologies that were employed in terms of the insight you gained through the papers that were offered for the special issue and submitted for the special issue and accepted. What type of research? Is it mainly small scale work which happens within particular local communities, or were there studies that cover several sites, or country level analysis? And in terms of methodologies, are there any prevailing approaches, and what were be your suggestions for the future based on the knowledge which was submitted for the issue?
Quite a lot of the papers were qualitative and drawing on interviews and so forth with various people, and that sort of suggests to me that's, you know, that's what social workers are comfortable with, but it also brings out those real insights into what is happening. There were a few mixed method papers, and yes, I think there was, you know, quite a broad sweep. But when you say were they small area, not necessarily. There were, you know, some, for example, a quantitative analysis of Israeli social workers, which was much more broad sweeping. And yeah, there were various different methodologies, but qualitative data certainly came through.
And there is also one scoping paper, and they use the findings to project what we can do under COVID. So they have some varieties, yeah. And we also have 4 conceptual papers. So they built on the conceptualization and lined up the logic of argument of how we should see the response to disasters and pandemic.
Excellent. So both conceptually and in terms of primary research, the profession is starting to build a knowledge base in relation to this field. Does this decision to merge and look into both disasters and the pandemic, does it feel, you mentioned that there were many similarities, is this something to consider going forward, that we need to kind of look at a broader field of social work in extreme events, so to speak, or is there also a need to keep focus to specific events and specific impacts, let's say, of natural disasters or public health disasters such as pandemics?
I think there's room for both, but I think the beauty of this edition is it's broadened our outlook of disasters. So one thing that I haven't seen papers on yet are social work in terrorist situations and conflict situations, and I think we need more understanding of that as well as part of the disaster literature. So I think there's room for both, but I think there's also great developments coming from this merging of the 2 areas and bringing out, well, what does it mean for social work? How visible is social work? How is social work involved in governance issues? Are policies being shaped that address social work issues? Are they being resourced in ways that will allow them to address the issues that they're facing, et cetera, et cetera? So, you know, I think the future in this particular area will grow and grow and grow. And that's in some ways due to the alarming fact that there will be ongoing disasters and ongoing pandemics. So, yeah.
And unfortunately, ongoing political conflicts and terrorism.
And ongoing political naivety is a positive way of saying it, or maybe a negative way is political neglect. and political grandstanding around things like climate change and disasters. We have to be very, very astute about how we can direct and help to shape policy into the future, because we need a lot more attention in that area as well. And I think social workers are really well placed to address and build policy solutions.
I totally agree with Margaret's idea, because when we read the COVID paper, actually it is not the COVID, the pandemic that affect the person. It's the policy, like the social isolation, that affect the person. So this is also a good reminder for us when we implement some policy. We also need to anticipate what are the consequences and what will be affected, and that is also something I think is also interesting.
And in many, many countries, particularly more developed countries, the policies of kind of retraction of social welfare support for peoples and kind of decreasing funds available for social services has been an issue. And then pandemic happened within that context, which affected both people we work with and social workers themselves. Because with fewer resources, that is a broader issue and a policy issue as a decision. And highlighted problems with that.
And that sort of leads into one of the issues that emerged from the papers, was the secondary impacts of the disaster and secondary impacts of COVID in particular. So the lockdowns, the need for people to wear masks, etc. And the social isolation in particular was picked up by a number of papers. That issue of people, for example, not being able to attend funerals, not being able to be with people in palliative care. So secondary impacts of the pandemic are very evident. That's a general statement across all disasters, I would suggest.
So what are your plans, having done this work? Do you have a sense of what might be your plans for the future work you two will do?
Oh, that's a very, very big question, actually. I would like to see a lot more involvement of social work at the international level into, disaster planning, disaster development, disaster cooperation at UN level, for example. And, a lot more involvement then at national levels, with social workers being on policy positions, etc. So when you ask me if I'm going to do that into the future, no, but I'll be advocating for that.
And since I am teaching at the university, definitely this special edition will be one of the textbooks for my students to remind them they had to be prepared and to address issues from multi-dimensions. And secondly, I admire the frontline practitioners. A lot of time when we do research, we think researcher is superior, but you can see a lot of our papers from this edition, they are from frontline and they have very, very valuable information. So we should humble and collaborate with the practitioner and makes our work more clear. Yeah. But lastly is one key word throughout the paper is flexibility. So this is a lesson I learned. Don't get stuck to have a regular program or whatever. Just let go and be flexible, and that will help us to overcome all kind of pandemics or disasters. Yeah.
Flexibility and creativity in social work when faced with disasters. Yeah, that sums up, I think, very, really well the activities, and certainly puts forward the idea of hope that you emphasise for Janet Boddy's paper as something for us to build for the future. I really want to thank both of you for your time and effort to put this issue together, and I can't wait for people to read it. And I hope there'll be opportunities to work with both of you in the future. And thanks to everyone for watching, and I hope you will enjoy the special issue too, and we all look forward to hearing your comments about it. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you.